Market structures. A very, very interesting reading. We're going to look at how firms try to maximize their profit. We're going to have an introduction to the different market structures, starting with perfect competition, where you've got a lot of firms selling exactly the same thing. Then you've got monopolistic competition where you still have a lot of firms, but they're selling some things which are a little bit differentiated. So, like smartphones or automobiles, that they're almost the same, but there's difference in features. Then you've got oligopoly, fewer firms. And then you've obviously got monopoly, which is just one firm. And then we are going to talk about what is the technique or what are the different techniques available for an analyst to determine a certain market structure in a given industry. So, as discussed, we will be looking at all the different market structures such as perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, monopoly, what are their characteristics, and firms within those market structures, what type of a demand curve they face, what type of supply curve they have, what is the optimum price they can charge, and the level of output they should produce to maximize their profit, right? What is the level at which they break even? What is the level at which they should shut down their business? What is the concept of economies of scale and diseconomies of scale, where as you increase the quantity you are producing, initially your cost goes down, but then it starts going up. So you obviously want to produce at that optimum level where your cost is the least. So economies of scale is when your cost goes down, and diseconomies is when it starts going up again. So we will look at that. And last, we're going to look at techniques that analysts can use to identify what is the market structure a certain firm is operating in. So let's talk about profit maximization, production break even, shutdown, and economies and diseconomies of scale. But before we get into all of that, let's talk a little bit about the difference in perfectly competitive and imperfect competitive environment. So, when you are selling a product which is completely homogeneous, which means there is absolutely no difference in the product which one company is selling and the other company is selling, they're all selling exactly the same product, and therefore the level of competition is perfect. Then what happens is that the industry just comes to a certain price where, regardless of whatever level of quantity you want to sell, the price is fixed and that is set by the market. And that is the demand curve that you face as well, and that is also the marginal revenue curve which you face, which means for every additional unit that you sell, the revenue you will get will be exactly the same as the previous unit, because the price is not changing. And this is this flat horizontal demand curve which firms within this perfectly competitive industries face, right? Because their product is exactly the same. Now, on the other extreme, we have this downward sloping demand curve. And here you have to reduce your price if you want to sell a higher quantity. And think of an automobile like Mercedes or Rolls Royce or a Bentley, that they will charge a very high price, but they will sell a very little number of vehicles compared to a company like, well, I don't want to give an example, but think of a lower price automobile where you will have more quantity being sold and the price will be less, right? So the extreme of this imperfect competition is obviously monopoly, where there is absolutely no other competition, because a monopoly is just a single firm which is alone in that industry and nobody else is there to give them any competition, and they can charge whatever price they want. So what happens with a perfectly competitive firm is that they face this flat horizontal perfectly elastic demand curve, and each firm is a price taker. They take the price from the market. They are in no position to set the price of the market. Whereas on the other extreme, with a monopoly can set the price. And think of your local electricity or water supply company. Of course, the government must be controlling them, because that's what the governments do with monopolies. But if the government wasn't controlling them, then they could literally charge you any price for electricity, and you would have to pay it because there's nobody else giving electricity to your local community, right? So that is with a completely imperfect competitive situation. But with a perfectly competitive market, each firm has no pricing power. And think of a product like onions. I mean, if somebody is going to charge a higher price for onion, nobody's going to pay it, because there will be a fixed price for a homogeneous good, and every industry or every firm has to sell at that price. And each additional unit is going to bring in the same price, so the average also stays the same, because the price is not changing. So the marginal revenue is the same, and the average revenue is also the same. Now, a good thing about your perfectly competitive market is that your total revenue keeps going up. Since the price is fixed, as you increase your quantity, your price is fixed, your quantity is going up, so your total revenue goes up. Now, that is more than we can say for an imperfectly competitive market. And as you can see, the total revenue goes up, but then it comes down. And why that happens is because of this MR curve, which is coming down. Now your demand curve is coming down, which means the price that if you're charging a high price, you'll only be able to sell little quantity. If you want to increase your quantity, you have to lower the price. And that is where this downward sloping demand curve comes in. But this downward sloping marginal revenue curve is what is interesting, that it's even going negative. And this I want to explain to you with this little example that I have over here. That think about it this way, that this is your demand curve. And let's say this industry is willing to buy a certain product at $50 per product, and they're willing to buy 50 units of that, right? So here you have your price on the y-axis and your quantity on the x-axis, and for $50 they can buy 50 units. Now if you want to increase your quantity to 100 units, the price needs to be reduced. So if you want to sell 100 units, you can. 100 units you can, but the price has to be reduced to $20. Now look at what's happening to the total revenue. The total revenue at 50 multiplied by 50 was $2,500, right? And then when you increase your quantity to 100 and reduce the price to 2,000, what is your total revenue over here? Your total revenue has actually come down. So the chart of the total revenue looks like this, where it's actually going up, and at a certain point it will maximize and it starts coming down. The reason for that is because if you look at the marginal revenue, that what is the extra revenue being brought in by each additional unit, so the increase in revenue is negative. However, the increase in units is positive. You went from 50 to 100. So each additional unit is actually not bringing in revenue. It is taking the revenue away from you. At some point over here, your marginal revenue actually became negative. And therefore, your marginal revenue curve is always going to be underneath the demand curve in a perfectly competitive firm. And your total revenue will be maximized at a certain given point. And this just shows how important all of this discussion is, because as a financial analyst, you obviously want to invest in companies which are profitable, which means not only should they try and increase their total revenue, but they also should try and maximize their profit, right? And clearly, as you can see, that the total revenue depends on the quantity level and the price level, and the quantity level depends on the price level. So the firm should be optimizing its quantity in a way where not only the total revenue is maximized, but where the profit is maximized. Now we will come to profit maximization later. Currently, what we want you to absorb from this discussion is that for an imperfectly competitive firm, the demand curve is downward sloping, right? And the marginal revenue curve is also downward sloping, and it is even lower than the demand curve. And your total revenue gets maximized but then starts going down. It subsequently decreases, and as your MR becomes negative. So when your MR is at 0, that is the maximum point for your total revenue, because once MR becomes negative, that means that every additional unit you sell is actually not bringing in revenue, it is taking away revenue from you, because the marginal revenue is now negative. No point selling anymore, because it's actually going to reduce your total revenue. And keep in mind, this is just revenue. Profit is a completely different story, because if for profit calculation we need to bring in cost as well. This is just the price and the revenue. Next, slowly we're going to bring in the cost charts and see how we are maximizing a profit, how a firm maximizes its profit. Anyways, a few words more about the revenue. So total revenue increases with greater quantity, as you can see, up until to a point where it is going to then start coming down. So there is a quantity at which the profit is maximized, and we will talk about that later once we bring in the cost curves. But what we want to first understand is that how total revenue is maximized and then starts coming down. And these are the two charts that we just discussed, put side by side. So we just have a summary discussion over here that for a perfectly competitive firm, the demand curve is horizontal, and that is the price and the marginal revenue. And the total revenue curve is upward sloping, because the price is fixed, and as the quantity goes up, the total revenue goes up. For an imperfectly competitive firm, the demand curve is downward sloping, the MR curve is also downward sloping, and it is lower than the demand curve and even goes negative. And the point at which it goes negative, that is where the total revenue of the firm is maximized.